Hi, welcome to Genesis Bible Study at Marshfield United Methodist Church. Let's get started with week 2. If you haven't seen week 1, you should probably go watch that because you will be a little bit lost, I would imagine. So to open up today, we're going to look at this little cartoon that I borrowed. And I want somebody to explain to me why this is funny. Who is sitting in the chair? Okay, well, what? Yes. Well, what's that guy's name? Darth Vader. Okay. And what's he looking at on that Mac? For Skywalker, right? And then he says, so Luke has a sister. What does the newspaper in his essay? Okay, so this is a little bit of a weird cartoon, but it tells us something kind of important, which is that most major genealogy websites that we used are owned by or run by people in Utah connected to the LDS Church, because the LDS Church has something called proxy baptism, and they baptize ancestors of their members back in history so that in heaven those ancestors have the option of accepting a baptism done for them posthumously. Now, this became very well known to the world in the 90s when the LDS Church started baptizing Holocaust survivors or Holocaust victims. Okay, so they had a list and they were baptizing, like, let's say Jason joined the LDS. Jason might be baptized 10 times when he's baptized under 10 different names. Proxy baptism for people in his family who had never accepted the gospel, maybe some random Japanese guy. Like, it was just a practice that was happening very heavily in the 90s. And some members of the Jewish community went to the LDS and said, please stop this. This is so disrespectful to us. Even one of them said in an official statement that they were killed because they were Jewish, and baptizing them without a choice was like killing them all over again. It was really robbing them of their Jewishness. And so the LDS issued an apology and said they wouldn't do that anymore. However, they still do a lot of genealogical databases. And there are still occasionally, like Anne Frank popped up in one of these databases in 2012, and there was a complaint and it was taken down. So they have an interest in knowing your genealogy because they do proxy baptism. Who are the leaders in the LDS Church? Who has the priesthood? You guys have never watched Big Love?
I mean, they have prophets and apostles.
Yes, but they have priests too. And it's men who have carried out their mission requirements and are in good standing with the church, they're priesthood holders. And so they have a lot of priests heading up families, and they have a sense of priesthood, of keeping genealogical records, of keeping track. They have tons and tons of records. This is all something to put into your mind for the rest of the class. Hi to all the Mormons watching. Okay, so let's talk about the P source, because that's the source we're going to do today. And this is the reason we've been talking about why that cartoon is funny only to me and Jason. The P source stands for priests. And priests have certain concerns. So in the LDS Church, there are lots of people with the same concerns, right? Not concerns like, I'm worried about you, but the things they think about, the things they think are super important, like keeping records, knowing when specific things happened, right? And so the P source is going to be the source that does all of that. So let's go back and talk about what we're doing here. We're talking about documentary criticism. Documentary criticism is not saying a document is bad. It's thinking critically about it. And so one of the things they're doing when they look at the documents, when scholars look at these documents, and it's something you can learn to do too, you're looking for the use of divine names. What is God being called? What is God's name in this? Because all those different ways that we talk about God from sentence to sentence in the Bible is not just artistic license. Also, they're looking at language and style, which is a little bit harder if you're not a Bible scholar, right? Contradictions and divergences within the text. It rained for 40 days. It rained for 150 days. What? How many days? It rained 190 days, right? So there are contradictions and divergences within the text. You see this actually in the Gospels. If you tried to put the Gospels together into one book, how many times did Jesus go to Jerusalem? It gets very confusing. Duplication and repetition of material. You find a lot of repeated stories in Scripture. We're going to go through one of those in a couple weeks. And then you find, like, I'm going to tell, there's a version of the story, and then maybe a few chapters later, there's a slightly different version of the same story. Sometimes we're repeating themes. Sometimes it's just like two versions got put in. And the evidence that different accounts have been combined. So that's kind of what we're looking at.
On the language, was Hebrew the primary language at that time?
I know it wasn't Greek. That's too later.
Well, when they're writing it,
Yes.
so probably yes. I mean, some of them, the oldest ones are going to be in Hebrew. You do get, because a lot of our oldest copies of the text are from about the 4th century.
BC,
AC. We don't call it AC. We call it BC. No, CE, Common Era. CE, Common Era. You get some other stuff, but you occasionally get like a Persian word in the Old Testament. Why would you have a Persian word?
They were written in Persia.
Right, or they were influenced by Persians in their area, and Persians don't come into play until quite late in the scene. And so if all of a sudden we're using a Persian word, where did you learn that word? When you were hanging out in Israel and tribes? No. You're going to pick that up from somewhere else. Okay, so let's move on here. So the 4 source hypothesis is what we're working with, the Graf-Wellhausen hypothesis. And so last week we learned about the J source or the Yahwist, remembering that it's called Yahwist because these were German scholars, and Yahweh is spelled with a J in German. And so that was probably written before 722 BC, because in 722 BCE, something really big happened, and the J source does not know about it. Right. So you wouldn't, well, not the split, the Assyrians. So let me double check the timeline, but I think it's the Assyrians are coming. Sorry to all the ancient Israelites watching. Israel fell to the Assyrians in 722. So you do see in the J source that it's very pro-unity. And so you get some late stuff in the J source that's like, hey, we should all stay together, which lets you know the discussion of whether we were splitting was going on in the conversation. I started thinking about it like this. Paul doesn't write a letter to anybody to tell them to stop doing something unless they're doing it. Right? So if you find scriptures that are addressing like what we should never do as a united kingdom is split up, like someone's calling that question. He's not just saying that because that's good. And so in the J source, we have God is always Lord, YHWH, the Tetragrammaton. God is anthropomorphic. God walks and talks and says things and smells things and pats Molly on the back. God is tied to the land. So this is a little bit more, this is a newer idea that you need to know. God is in the south. It is God of this land in the south in Judah, Jerusalem, and that land is dry land. Water comes onto it. Water comes up from it. It isn't what was there in the beginning, because this is a desert place. And in the J-Source, people are flawed. The story is epic, kind of mythical, one might say. And there are themes of, the creator and the created, and the creation trying to take the place of the creator, and the creator saying, no, I'm the creator, while he's standing there, because God is anthropomorphic. There's themes of judgment and renewal. Jason did something wrong, but God has forgiven him and brought him back into the bosom of the faith, right? God made promises to Jason, and now God is fulfilling those promises, right? We try, we fail. These are the kinds of elements you see in a J story. It's a very good base narrative for those first 4 books of the Bible, although not in all of them. 5 books. And then the next source you're going to learn is the P source, the priestly source, and this was written during exile. And that changes absolutely everything. So if you haven't done a ton of biblical history, this is my timeline that I built, that I keep in all of my Bible studies so that we can all be on the same page. So today's sermon talked about what time period?
Oh, the kingdom split, yeah.
Right, the split of the kingdom. So it's after this split of the kingdom, but it's before Israel falls. Oh, I didn't know that was going to be animated. That's annoying. Sorry about that. So it's somewhere between the split and the fall, which is real close. Really close. 922 they divide, 722 they fall. Okay. So there's about 200 years, and Israel falls to the Assyrians. So it's right here in this little blip of time. The first temple's there. The first temple hasn't been destroyed. After all of that happens, Israel falls in the north to the Assyrians. They try being a vassal state. It doesn't go well. And then the Assyrians just come in, and we get the idea that they're wiped out, except they aren't really wiped out. They're going to become the Samaritans. And then we're going to get all the stories of Jesus and all the people being anointed. Those people who do things in their weird way, and they're like us, but they're not quite like us, and it's not right, and there's nothing's not a good Samaritan. I mean, they didn't all get murdered, right? And they have the same policies and holidays and stuff that we just heard today in church that they have in Dan, right? So the Northern Kingdom seems to have sort of done, they're there, okay? It's not super clear, but they seem to just be like turn into the Samaritans. So Israel falls off the map. Nobody's talking about them anymore. And then in 587, Judah falls to the Babylonians. So it takes, about 140 years before where Judah is the only thing, just that little southern kingdom. And then they fall to Babylon, and Babylon comes and takes all of the people who can write and read and takes them to Babylon to work. And they become workers in Babylon. So who did they take? Who can read and write? Priests. And so a lot of them are priests, and the priests are sitting in Babylon. Have you ever met anyone who is here as a refugee, in your country as a refugee? And when you have a refugee, do they want to just drop their old culture and completely embrace the new one and forget where they came from? No. In fact, their history, their religious practice, all those things give them a sense of self, right? So what are the priests doing in exile? They're writing down their stories when they have time. They're getting together and saying, what do we have to remember? Because we were on the land that God was on, and we got judged and we got sent off. And now, how are we going to stick together? And they sat by the rivers of Babylon, like we read in that psalm last week, and they wept and they wrote down their stories. And they wrote down the rules of what maybe they had done or what they think should be done. And that's the P source. But it's stories from the prehistory, right? All the way back here forward, all of Leviticus is P source, all of this stuff. But we have to accept that it wasn't written in, negative 2200. It was written here in like 588, 586, 585 in exile. It's written in 6 centuries before Christ. That's when a lot of the P source was written. So were they working off of documents that existed? Maybe, but they're going to have their own distinctive spin. I mean, you guys tell me stories about your church history all the time. And when I tell them to you, they have a different spin because priests going to do that. Like, that's what we do. And so we just think about things a little bit differently, right? So they're sitting during the exile from 587 to 539 BC, or maybe even after. I think the exile makes the most sense. They're written by refugees trying to preserve their way of life, traditions, religion, national identity. And they're written by the priests who have concerns like, well, whose child is that? How many generations have they been part of this, right? Like the LDS, right? This is what the priests are paying attention to, is genealogy, chronology. You remember, we read the Noah's Ark story. One of them told us nothing about when it happened, and one was like, okay, on the 7th day of the 18th moon of the 3rd year after this thing you've never heard of, when Noah was 816. Sorry, Noah, if you're watching. That's a priest, because nobody else cares. Like, that doesn't really tell us anything. The priests care. So also ritual. If you've ever tried to read, Leviticus kills more Bible reading than any other book, because people get into Leviticus and they're just like, why? It's a priest's manual for how, it's like reading the Discipline instead of the Bible. It's boring. Discipline is the book of Methodist ritual and order, and it's boring unless you're me. And then I'm like, oh, I love all these little loopholes. This is so fascinating. No one else cares, right? So that's what the P source is. But you're going to get some of the best writing of the Bible because they had all this time and this passion. So when they're not just making lists of rules, they're writing really nice things. Like, where is it? Can I just have a Bible sitting here?
There you go. Go to the source.
I'll just grab the Bible. I gotta get past the preface. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the waters. Priests. And it's beautiful. Now, it knows a wet place is reality. And God moved over the face of the waters. So the P source is squishy. It knows water. Babylon is wet. There are lots of rivers. So they were writing from a place that was wet. Now, one thing to remember is in that time frame, you can have another generation. So it's not necessarily that we brought over a bunch of elderly men who are the priests. Like, this was a generational thing. They would have families of them, right? So you could have people who were involved in the writing who had never known Judah and people who had known Judah. So you're going to get this, like, it's not just, oh, it's a bunch of desert people in a wet place. They procreated while they were there and raised up more priests. And the P source is specific. So the flow of the story sometimes, but most of the time, it's all the little details. I just imagine them sitting down and writing down the old stories and then being like, when did that even happen? And who is that guy? You know, because there weren't a lot of details in the other stories. They all come from the priests. Aaron is the first priest, and Aaron is a hero. Aaron never does anything wrong from the P source, right? Because where do we get our authority from? The priests, right? Aaron being a priest. So he is a hero. Oh my gosh, we love it. Aaron, don't ever tell a story about him building a golden calf and right? That would not be the P source, right? They would, but you're going to see layers of like, here's what Aaron did. Oh, but Aaron did that because poor Aaron. Okay. All of Leviticus's P source, some of the rest of the Torah is outside, interwoven into the other stories, including bits of the prehistory, like creation, like Noah's Ark. It's like they went back with the old campfire story and went, but not enough. We have a new theological understanding, and we're going to talk about that. And of course, we don't know if it was a standalone document or a correction to what they already had. So in the P source, God is Elohim, God, until God names God's self to Moses. Remember, he comes to Moses, and Moses says, but Lord, tell me your name. And he says, and that's what YHWH means, I am. That's what that means. And so in the priestly source, you see a switch from calling God Elohim to calling God YHWH because he has revealed himself as I am. In the P source, God is not walking and talking and standing around your bedroom looking at you. God is not sowing you anything, feeding you anything. God is transcendent. God is disembodied. It is a bigger God in some way. And God is powerful. When God wants to create, God doesn't go down and put Adam to sleep and reach in his chest and pull out a rib. God thinks it, says it, boom, and then judges it. Right? That's a farther away God, a more powerful God, a God that speaks creation into existence. And God is not tied to the land they are on. God is not the God of Judah. God is the God of the universe in the P source. Now, I don't know if you are on Facebook and you do this, but sometimes I scroll through Facebook. I don't even look at who put stuff on. I'm just scrolling and then I see something and I go, oh my gosh, that is so Chris. I'm going to save it. And what's wrong? Chris posted it. Right? And so I just saw something that smelled like Chris so much I was going to, but of course it smells like Chris. She posted it. I've done it with Amanda too. Like, oh, I'm going to send that. Amanda put that Zillow Gone Wild up there, or Historic Houses of America. That's what you can learn to do with the P source. You'll be scrolling through the Bible, reading through, and you'll be like, I smell priests. So that's the easiest one to recognize. It's the first one I ever recognized, and it changed my whole career trajectory because I was like, oh, all of a sudden this makes so much more sense to me. So we spent weeks in seminary dealing with the fact that people could not handle the idea that there were two creation stories. Okay, this really shook people up, and they didn't understand that they're in the wrong order. Okay, so let's talk about this creation story for us. You have, let's go past. You saw in the flood story that those scriptures from the P source and the J source were sort of wedged in there together. And I pulled them out separately. So the creation stories are very different. You get story one. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, and God moved over the face of the waters or the deep, right? And God said, let there be light, right? What source is that? Is God walking and talking? Nope. Is it wet? Yeah, it's real wet. It's the P source. So the priest wrote that very powerful God. I keep banging that. I'm sorry, Josh. I'm probably upsetting your eardrums. I keep smacking. Okay. So when the P source is writing out this creation story, it's a big, powerful God. And then all of a sudden, there's one transition verse, and we're walking in the garden and we're creating all over again. And this story is different. God is in the garden. There's dry land, and then water comes up. And all my life, I've been trying to let that be the one story my Baptist upbringing told me it was. It's one story. It doesn't make sense that it's one story because it contradicts and there are it's a different order. It's a dry place. It's a wet place. How come God is walking and talking in this story? And how come God is just speaking into existence? These are very different concepts of God. So, little bit of a brain exercise for you that helped me understand this.
I love that we have both and they didn't just throw one away.
Yes, that's exactly right. It enriches it, right? It gives us a better, fuller picture, but it also gives us an idea of how our religious ideas developed over time. And people are often afraid to learn this because if we consider that our ideas developed over time, then which ones were righter? The old ones or the new ones? And we're not going to agree on that, right? We're not going to agree on that. Well, maybe we will because we're Methodists. We'll be like, both. We'll take it all. So the key to me was realizing that that there are some moments in the Bible that are really uncomfortable. Let us make mankind in our own image. In God's own image, he created them, male and female, he created them. Except there's a plural word there, right? Our own image. And there are moments like that in Genesis in particular, where it seems to suggest that the Israelites thought there was more than one God. You heard it today in the sermon from Kings, right? Oh, Israel, here are your gods that brought you up out of Egypt. So, and I was the kid in Sunday school who'd be like, I have a question, and I would want to know why there was a plural word. So when the Israelites go into Canaan, they're from Ur. They're from Ur of the Chaldeans, right, with Abraham. And eventually they go into Canaan, and then they go to Egypt, and they come back to Canaan, and they conquer Canaan. But then in the next book, there's a bunch of Canaanites still there. So there's some debate over whether they conquered or they blended, right? And whether all of them were really like Urians, or whatever that word is, or whether they were already kind of Canaanite. Like maybe the early tribes, when they married people, there were Canaanites around. And so Canaanites believed in multiple gods. And we know that Moabites had Chemosh, and you get different names, Asherah, different names that the different people around there, of course, Jay just likes to call them Canaanites and dismiss them. But they basically were polytheists, or they were monolatrists. Monolatrists believe there is more than one God, but ours is the boss. Okay, so there's a pantheon, but there's Zeus in charge. So we're comfortable with those as myths when we read the Greek stuff or the Roman stuff. That was probably going on. Did you just have an aha?
Yeah.
Okay, what's your aha? Was it about physics?
Do you think that the reason the Greeks have their
God system they do, Zeus in charge and
It's
lower gods
monotheistic.
below.
I don't know how much they were in communication until the sea people showed up. I think it's I don't know where they would have had
They were
communication.
after.
Right. Well, but there were precursors there. I mean, there were people in Greece before we met them
Yeah.
in Israel, right? Before they show up as the sea people during the Bronze Age. So I think that was kind of the prevalent idea there in the Mediterranean, in the Levant area there, that there are multiple gods and ours is the boss. And you sometimes run into that in the Pentateuch, and your pastor doesn't stand up and go, "Oh, look, this is back when we thought there were several," right? Because it doesn't sell well, because we are monotheists, and our Jewish brethren are in Sistren are very, very much monotheists. They are more monotheistic than we are now. But scholars believe, actually, because of the influence of Canaan and because of the assimilation of Canaanites and Israelites, and there are lots of theories on what that looked like, that they picked up this monolatry. And so God, our God, may be one God, and it's one God because God came to Abraham and said, I am one. I am the one God. And that's the first time there is monotheism that we know of. Boom. Abraham and God. And God says, I am one. You will have no other gods before me. Why do you need that law? Because people had other gods, right? It doesn't, we have to really think about how we're going to carry that out. And we're like, well, maybe football's my God. That's not what it's about. It's about like Chemosh or, the other gods in the area. Yes.
What about the interpretation that it's his heavenly host that he's speaking to?
Well,
These are also creatures. They're not gods. They're his creations as well.
I think that's how we get around it. Like get around the what's that?
How we smooth it.
How we smooth it. Like I think it's how we smooth it.
And like Jesus being present.
That's the official answer, is let us make mankind in our own image. God was talking to Jesus and the Holy Spirit.
The Trinitarian.
Right, but that's putting Christianity on top of a Jewish text, right? And so I try not to do that. I try to let God speak through the text as God spoke through the text.
Right.
And maybe that is God speaking through the text. But I think the sooner you can kind of accept, like sometimes they say some weird plural stuff that's not my belief, it's going to be okay, because they say a bunch of stuff that's not your belief. I mean, you don't follow the laws of Leviticus, thank God.
It's not the Trinity then.
It could be. That is a legitimate Christian interpretation of it.
And it makes sense that God's spirit could move through the writer to put that in there.
Right.
So that in our day it would be fulfilled.
It also helps us to know that the priests were writing that. And so it's a later writing. So it's probably beyond the monolatry stage of things, right? Because it's probably written during the exile in that priest form. Who is it? Is it the heavenly host? Okay. Is it the Trinity? Okay. Is it early monolatry 1 through? All right. I mean, there are different answers to it. So you will find that it is monotheistic, but the emphasis is on the wrong syllable sometimes. And it's like, our God, we have the only God, our God is better than your God. Okay, that doesn't make any sense. I've heard pastors say that. I heard a pastor say one time, Allah just wishes he served at the table that our God served at. And I went, dude, no, don't say that. So they've got this monolatry thing going on.
I'm still back on this. If there's one God, how can mine be better than yours? Because there is no other.
Right, because we are reading strict monotheism on a group that is fighting toward monotheism. They are the whole, like Hebrew scriptures, what are they doing? They start going along fine, and they're worshiping God, and then they turn around and they're like, oh, Asherah pole. And they all walk back and they do a little dance around the Asherah pole, and then God judges them, and they're like, oh yeah, we're getting judged because there's only one God. Next week, they're doing something else. I mean, it's a repeated issue. And so some of the Bible is Israelite history, and some of it is religious history and records of all the times they tried to go back to what they knew, which is monolatry. It's hard to think about. It doesn't mean the Bible is, if anything, the Bible is just arguing that there is one God. But the people are failing to understand it over and over again. These are the same people whose descendants will write it, right? And they know a little bit better than we do because they're closer to it, how much confusion there is. So I'm sitting and I'm telling my early creation story as a writer of the J Source to you, my friends. And I'm telling you the creation story, and God is walking in the garden, and God is talking to me, and we are in the Garden of Eden, and this is our story of how we're created. It's a very local story, right? It's a very us, our land. This is how it was created. The priests are not on that land anymore. They have realized, they have made a huge theological jump, because they all thought, the Israelites all thought, there was only, they got to the point, there's one God, and it's the God of our land. And our God is better than whatever might be out there that's real or not real. Okay, that's where they got. And then they all got kicked off their land. Now they're in Babylon. And they pray and they feel the presence and they realize, oh my gosh, God didn't stay in Judah. It's the same God here. Our God is the... Let me tell you how the world came to be. Our God, when there was nothing but water, moved over the face of the water in spirit form, and God said, let there be light. And there was, it's cinematic, right? This is a backup and God is bigger. God is better, so to speak. In common parlance, not the old way. Thinking bad means bad. So this is a bigger God. It's like a correction, like a big, one God, super powerful. That's the God we know. That's the God we know. And yet I grew up in the church I grew up in, listening to stories about how Eve should be subordinate to Adam. And that's the point of the creation story. That's why women shouldn't, teach Sunday school, right? Like that's the creation story we got a lot of, because it was very good for social order. And I was in seminary before I realized the first story said male and female, God created them. And I was like, oh, that's the big story, right? That's the big story. So I think if you can get in your head that sometimes you're going to trip over, occasionally they might suggest there are other gods around, but they're getting there. Have patience. And then that it doesn't replace the story that we had when we were locals on the land. It doesn't mean God wasn't the God of our land in Judah. It just means we didn't understand how big God was. And that exile God, that's the one we know. It's the same God. But the people's understanding changed. And so for me, it's really fascinating to know where these sources are and to know about when they happen, because you can walk through their understanding, and it helps us accept that our understanding isn't the same that John Wesley's was in the 1700s, and John Wesley's was different than the Middle Ages. We do make progress. It's not all wrong. And I don't know what point we pick and go back to. So that's the creation story in the P source. And it's important to remember that the P source provides religious instruction. The peace source is about Judaism. It is not about Christianity. It is not about Israelite history. It is not about who the king was and what he was up to, unless there was a prophet involved or maybe some kind of religious correction. So this is Judaism. It's not the rules of the state, it's the rules of worship. And so it also provided great comfort to people who thought God was tied to them through land. If you were in exile and you're sitting by the rivers of Babylon and the people are telling you to sing the songs of your land, and somebody came and read you that creation story, and God was the God of the universe, like that would be so comforting. What do you mean God isn't still in Judah mad at me and kicked me out of God's very presence? God is present with me now. I can understand this a different way. And it provided comfort to refugees that God still has control over all things. So that when the Persians come in and the Persians look at the Israelites or the Judeans that are in exile still in Babylon, and Persia now runs it, and they look at them and go, "What are you doing here? Why don't you go home?" And they were like, "Really? Okay, let's go." And they left. Not all of them, but some of them. And they went back because they didn't think they were like the people of a local God, and the local God hated them and sent them away. They didn't think that anymore because of the work of the priests. It's pretty good stuff. Is that it? All right. So let's go through some of these questions. Let's see if you have any questions now. I said a lot of big stuff. We did monolatry. You just see people in seminaries' heads just spin around like, well, he's going to drop out next week. I joke. Lots of people did. Okay. So let's talk about our questions. Did you find it after reading the J question? Could you tell that your reading this week in the flood story was not the J source?
We sort of settled that 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, we settled it when we did it. Okay. So when we look at the creation story, and I just sort of gave you the same form, you know what the form is.
Reading C questions or?
I'm looking at reading D questions, but this is not my book.
It's not.
It's your book.
It is.
Ugh. Where's my book?
I don't know. Uh-oh, Teach. What's going on?
No, that was his book. I'll grab another book. All right. It's like the Emperor's New Clothes. Okay. All right. So when we look, do you have any questions before we look at these? Do you have any questions at all? Yes, Chris.
Well, this is going back to the questions for reading C, but I'm really intrigued with what kind of answers would come up for question 1.
The version of Noah's Ark has a covenant but no sacrifice.
Right.
Noah had animals, knives, and people. What is he missing that he needed to make a sacrifice? A priest.
I said an altar.
You know what I said?
What?
Firewood.
He had a whole ark. It's a wet story. Yes, it is a wet story. That's a very good answer. So he doesn't have a priest. Remember in the other part of the Noah's Ark story, what does he do? He goes out and he builds a fire, and God walks by and is like, that smells good, which I think is so weird. A priest would have been shocked. What was Noah doing? Noah doesn't have the right to do that. He's never even been to seminary, So there's a little bit more of that in scripture than we probably anticipate. There was some of it I want you to think about today's sermon and what we learned about Dan and the priests and all that stuff. That's going to come up again when we talk about this, because it all goes back to Aaron and who has the right to do any kind of religious leadership. He didn't have a priest. And what are they now allowed to do? They're allowed to eat meat. Mm-hmm.
So according to this, were they vegan until the flood?
Yes. Until
So
after the
Adam
flood.
was, in fact, laying down with the lamb in the garden.
Yes. They were not eating meat. They got plants. He did a wedding one time for somebody whose dad was a pastor and a leader in a different denomination. And I had done their wedding and we were sitting at the reception, and the dad of the groom started going at the bride about how she was going to not heaven because she was a vegetarian. And that she was not following, and this is his daughter-in-law at their wedding reception, but she ordered like cheese enchiladas or something. So he just started on her, and I was like whipping out Genesis. Like, she's just old school, okay? She's just living into pre-flood covenant.
Wait, it allows you to eat meat. Doesn't force you to eat.
No, pre-flood though, they didn't eat meat. Right. But he took it as you weren't living. He was going all the way to like Peter and the kill and eat and in the New Testament. And I was like, let's go back to Genesis, okay? Still friends with her. All right. What about the language? Let's go ahead to reading D. So 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Is God anthropomorphic? No, that's 8. In 7, they both have sections marked that begin and end with asterisks. What similarities do you see in the language or the message in those passages? Did you find anything in there?
Will increase
Mm-hmm.
in both of them.
And they do that, the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature. It's almost like they had a list of how they were going to talk about animals. Like, this is the way we do it. Anybody have anything else there? Yes? Yes, Ken. Okay, hold on. Let's switch the camera to Ken.
Slavery, exiled to another country, the whole Moses story, and that God was the salvation of an entire people through Moses, and that he acted in history to bring people out of slavery and so how important would it be that they get that Moses story down and important to celebrate and all that kind of thing? Just curious.
Very important. Let's take a gander at something. I bet.
Jeez, Ken. That's supposed to be 2 weeks from now.
No, it's not. It's in Exodus. It's not even in here. Kick. I will tell you next week. I will look up where, like, how much P is involved in Exodus, but I'm sure there's some because Aaron, right? This is we love Aaron, and Aaron becomes pretty prevalent. I think there's a third source in there. I think this third source pops up and it makes it a little more confusing. The third source is probably the hardest, the one we're going to go over next week.
How much writing do people think they actually had with them? And do they think that, some kind, traditionally Moses wrote the 5 books, and which is virtually impossible given the content of the books. But so did they have any writing already with them when they were in Babylon?
That's what we're not sure of. Like, at what point did they sit down and write the stories out? But, again, it's like that that thing where Paul doesn't address something unless it's happening somewhere. And so one of the prevalent theories is that they had J and they had E, which is next week's, and they may have had all of it, and it may be part of a larger scale, but then after the exile, when they get restored, a redactor comes in and smooths it all out to make it one big national story, right? Because it's hard to tell, when do you stop writing your story? And it's not like the first copy is, okay, that's my version and that's the national story. It's the national story. So the J source is from the South. What does that mean the E source is going to be from? The North. There's going to be a real different set of stories from the North, right? Really different set of stories. Today's story was a J kind of story in Kings, because Jeroboam was a troll for doing this and daring to do anything against Jerusalem, right? There's a distinctively different way to understand that story. We couldn't get to Jerusalem, and so we had to put up something. And there's scholars right now that are working on, what do those calves look like? Are they just God's giant seat? Or were they actually the same kind of golden calves? Like, what if you look at it from the northern perspective? Was that the sin of Jeroboam was assigned in Jerusalem? You see what I mean? So there's a little bit of that, but of course, Judah won. So we know when they went into exile, they must have had some of E, because E was northern people and they were gone. And they had some of J. So how much of the shuffling took part there, or did they write another thing? I've always sort of imagined they sat down and had the pieces, wrote the corrections to make the story a bigger, more detailed story, and then someone later shuffled it. Because the shuffling is the most skillful shuffling. I don't know if you've seen page 62 in your notebook. This is the way Noah's Ark story is shuffled. It is a mirror with all of these pieces, and it just echoes beautifully. This is masterful. A masterful writer. There's nothing out of place. Probably a redactor or a priest. This could be a priest's whole life's work, right? It's just getting that story perfect. What we don't have is a copy of J, and we don't have a copy of E. We do have some of D, just because D wrote enough stuff on their own and is a more clear point in time. But when was it all shuffled together? We're not completely sure. But they had some of it when they were in exile. Because if you know you're getting sent off your land and you're going as refugees, you grab the most important stuff you have. So they were already writing it down, or they sat down, and any northern survivor who might be involved, but I think they took it with them. That's what I would do, and I'm priestish, right? I would take the red book from the United Methodist Church in Marshfield to wherever we got exiled and be like, we start with this. That red book. And probably that red book. Not Red Book Magazine. I don't even know if that's real anymore.
It's probably online.
Oh, I'll look it up later. Yeah. Wish I hadn't. Oh, I'm not taking that quiz. All right. So any remaining questions? Is it burning in your head? Is it just all a jumble, or is it coming into focus? Okay. It's coming into focus. It's hard. So I'll tell you, my parents have taken this several times. My mom pointed out they've taken it online. They've taken it in person. they pointed out that there was something last week that suddenly like brought things into focus for my mom in a different way. Every time I teach the class, I see something different. And I'll tell you this time, it's all about the priest and Aaron and the North and the South. And you can see when I'm preaching, last week I preached a creation story, right? And we preached, and what was the point? I won't remember because I preached it 2 weeks ago, but we talked about the point we took out of that story was about not being alone, that human beings are not supposed to be alone. You can interpret those stories and pull the pieces out because they're rich stories. They're good stories. That sermon, my sermon on the creation story with Adam, Eve in the garden does not have to be that I should be washing the dishes every night. Right? Even though I grew up hearing that kind of idea, or that women are evil and have this snake in the garden. Like, oh no. So I can preach it as, oh, that's why you don't like snakes. Oh my goodness. That's hilarious. Actually, that's in the Bible to tell us, I think, why we don't like snakes. Right? I mean, if you go back and read those stories, you can ask, what is this supposed to be teaching me right now? It may not always be teaching you the same thing at the point you're in your life, but if you understand where it came from, these were stories that were fundamental. These were the stories they told around the campfire to know who they were. What does it tell us about who we are and the love that they felt from God way back then? You know, and is it the same? Does that mean I'm stuck washing the dishes? Yes, I am. Jay doesn't do it yet.
I noticed that one of the questions you had in the book was, the whole idea that Christianity, as a general statement, operates on the idea that God created everything from nothing,
Ex nihilo.
and that it doesn't actually read like that. And I was wondering because I stumbled into what's called the dependent clause interpretation of Genesis.
Oh my
Genesis
gosh.
1.
Okay.
Oh my gosh. So okay. I was wondering.
He's got a book for you to read. Okay.
But the idea is that it kind of changes the language a little bit. And when God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and wind from God sweeping over the water, God said, "Let there be light." Like the only active form of creation at that point in time is at the very end of that statement.
Right. And that's okay. So I'm not.
Oh no.
Let's see if I can believe both things. Then okay. Now I agree with scripture. We do that so much. Like I have to have it be the way Augustine said it was. You don't have to.
No,
what does it say? What does it say? Is it okay with you that isn't what you always learned? Okay. Can you learn something new today? Yep. It's a lifetime thing.
Yeah.
Just because I understand it this day and I didn't understand it 10 years ago like that doesn't mean I was wrong then, but I am done contorting myself to make stuff work. If God moved over the face of the deep, okay. Does that mean there was water? Okay. Does there have to be water? Nope.
There is significance to be hovering over the water rather than hovering over the deep.
Right. I'm okay with all of it.
There's been some times in my life where I would get this like faith just shivering of like I felt like something had rattled my foundation. I'd get nervous, but if I just kept pressing, it led me to deeper understanding and more beauty of God. But there's been several moments where something popped up and it just shook me. And like, oh my gosh, that's not what I was taught. Is everything I've, like you do the whole reflection thing, but it always leads to deeper goodness.
So here's my last congregation. Of course, I was with them for 14 and a half years, and I preached everything I could think of. I taught them everything I knew about the Bible up to that point, because I had to come up with something to say every week, 52 Sundays for 14 and a half years. And I had a lady come to me one week and she said, I didn't know I had sacred cows until you threw them on the grill. She said, every week you grill another one of my sacred cows. What does God do? What happens to the sacred cow? In Exodus, what happens? I told you this morning.
Melted and you eat it.
Yeah. Moses melts it down. He grinds it into powder. I'm not sure what happened from melted gold to like it was already gold, but grinds it into powder, feeds it to the people, and gets rid of it. We're not supposed to have sacred cows. We're not supposed to have sacred cows. So I will barbecue all of them. And not as an act of malice, but as an act of love, because our faith needs to be flexible enough that it can bend with reality. I can't tell you how many people come to me and they're like, well, my dad died, so I've lost my faith. What? But something will happen, and it's like, well, I thought things were going to go good for me because I have faith. That's not flexible. Sometimes horrible things happen to us in life, and God is the one who walks with us through that. And if our faith can't bend to learn that it's deep or it's water, or that there might have been water at the beginning, oh my gosh, like if that's making us clutch our pearls, we're not going to make it through. We're not going to make it through with our faith intact. So I am a little bit like a hammer, knocking at you, trying to get your faith more flexible, because that's the faith I think you need. And so we can get at some of those issues by breaking apart some of those things we've always thought, because that's what we were told and we remembered it forever. None of that. Believing that God created ex nihilo has nothing to do with your salvation, right? But people will fight me on it. And I'm like, believe whatever you want, but so will I. And what I think is, I don't know. I'm Methodist, I'm okay with that. Right? So I don't have all the answers, but I can give you lots more questions to ask. And at the end of the summer, we're going to have a great big biblical barbecue.
Sacred cow.
We are going to cook sacred cow. We're going to have lamb. It's going to be a biblical barbecue, but we're going to be revealing the different foods of the Bible throughout the summer, so that when we have the barbecue, you have had the menu given to you in sermon, right? But you will know that we're cooking sacred cows. Okay. All right. That's it. That's class.
So if life can be bent.
Oh my gosh. Yes.